All right, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. I want to thank all of you for joining us for a special edition of Beyond Compliance. This is our monthly webinar and podcast series. And on occasion, we have an opportunity to shift gears a little bit and do a little more of an interview style. And this month, I'm really excited about our guest, not just because I think they have a really great story to share, but I think individually, the person I'll be interviewing has a very unique approach and some really valuable insight that a lot of you will take away. So this is a success story about Highlife, and who is Canada's largest pork producer, and kind of the challenges they were facing, the process they went through to implement and continue to expand with SafetyChain, some of the best practices and learnings that they came away with, and obviously some of the value that they're seeing for their business. And so the idea behind these, we understand not everybody on here is a customer, and we think that's great because hopefully this will give you some insight, not just to how SafetyChain can help you, but just technology in general. So I think the way we're approaching this, and I really have to thank Tracy, whom I'll introduce here in a moment, for putting in some extra content that I think makes this extra valuable for wherever you're at in the process, whether you're considering technology, talking with us already, or even a customer. So welcome everybody. We're glad you're here. If this is the first time that you're joining us and we see some new faces, really cool to have you. This is a series we put together because started a couple years ago, and the idea was to pull in practitioners like we'll be doing today, fellow thought leaders, consultants, other experts in the industry who are actually doing the work, right? So we try not to just talk theory, we really try to talk about practices and strategies and tools and tips that you can take away and really apply to your various businesses. There's a common thread amongst food safety and compliance, quality, and all the way into operations that we try and touch on here. So we hope you enjoy the content. We hope you keep coming back, and if you do, we'll keep putting them on. And as we mentioned, as the sponsor of the series, this is something we're really proud to do and add value to our community. So you'll hear obviously today a lot about what we're doing with SafetyChain, although we won't be digging into specifics on demos or anything like that, but we're certainly welcome to sharing that afterward and talking a little bit more with you one-on-one about how one of our solutions in our food quality management system can help you, whether it's food safety, we have modules for QA, supplier compliance, and moving all the way into production, a whole lot more. So some exciting stuff coming up, and but I think today will give you a glimpse, more importantly, in how we help, not just the functionality and that sort of thing, which we can cover on a demo at another time. So kind of normal kind of housekeeping stuff for any webinar. The idea here today is to have a conversation, right? So if, the way I approach these is if we were all hanging out at a trade show, like I saw some of you probably last week at SQF, we were hanging around a table, this is the kind of conversation we would have. So I hope you appreciate, we've created some slides so you have some context, but really want this to be a conversation, but encourage you to ask questions. And if you do have some, I'll monitor those. If they're a little too specific, I'll take those offline, but we'll do our best to get any questions in towards the end if we have some time. And you'll notice you're only the panelists, so myself, Tracy, and our team are displayed on there. So anything you do send us is not broadcast to everybody. One of the most common questions that comes up, I'll get out of the way up front. We are recording this, and we will be sharing both the link and the slides afterwards. So if you just can't get enough, or you want to share this with a friend or colleague, which we certainly encourage, we'll have those out in the next day or so for you to share. And last but not least, there's a couple ways to connect on audio. If you're having any audio issues, you can use the chat box, and Cheryl on our team will do her best to help you behind the scenes. You can call in, or you can flip-flop over to the web audio, and sometimes that just does the trick. Kind of like plugging and unplugging your computer sometimes, right? It's that magic IT solve there. So with that, we're gonna dig in, because I'm really excited about this conversation. As I mentioned, I think the content we're going to share is really applicable to folks almost anywhere in the organization, and in a variety of departments, and also in a variety of stages in terms of looking at technology. So I'd like to bring in, and this is where the the music comes on if we were on stage, but wanted to introduce our guest today, Tracy Wallet. She is a passionate business analyst at Highlife Limited and works as applications manager there. We'll talk a little bit more about her role specifically, but her focus is on leading the team that provides innovative solutions and support to business problems using technology and software. This is an unexpected career path for a farm girl from South Manitoba, who I understand it is like 20 below there today. But she brings her dairy and broiler breeder farm experience to a company that provides farm to fork supply chain products to international customers. Her enthusiasm for problem solving and leadership goes well beyond work, where she is the devoted mother and dedicated volunteer on multiple committees. She brings passion to every commitment in her life and proves to be an asset to whomever she works with. And I can certainly echo that as a partner of hers here. She's a pleasure to work with. She's helped us become better at what we do. And so I want to welcome Tracy and make sure your audio is good and you can hear me okay.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending, I guess, where you're calling in from. And
Yeah,
audio is great, Brian.
awesome. Sounds good. Well, we are really, really excited to have you here. And I know we've got a lot to talk about. And I thought what might be helpful first, if you don't mind, is just for those that might not be familiar with Highlife, just a kind of a quick overview of what you guys do up there. As you said, you started off as an entrepreneur and kind of on the farm side, but now you're working with a pretty darn big company. So give us a little background about Highlife here.
And so, yeah, Highlife is a farm to fork. So we have all the way from farms to logistics to feed mills to processing plants, as well as genetics and veterinary health services. So we are end to end in the supply chain. We are international, and the majority of our product is exported. 2 million hogs per year, approximately, and yeah, we're super excited that we get to continue to expand to more and more countries all the time because they see the value in our product.
For sure. And I think for context for this conversation, for a lot of you, it's important to be thinking about the complexities that brings, that the majority of your product being shipped and the importance of certain things along the whole processing chain there, as well as doing business with right now 20 different countries. And I know that number's growing too. So as Tracy shares her story, keep all that in mind. And I'm sure that applies to a number of you that are on here listening today. So kind of wanted to start first, Tracy, just talking about how the project started. And you sit in an interesting part of the business where you're kind of between IT and the business. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit as well. But I believe, the initial challenge that was brought up to all of you was really around paper. And I think if I remember from our conversation, you even said there was a physical expansion being planned, and not just for the sake of filing, but one of the parts of that was to create more space for all the filing. So there was definitely like a paper problem, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the whole project kind of came about and what type of problems you guys were looking to solve with technology.
Absolutely. So the team that I manage is called the solutions team, and we have application analysts, and we have developers, and we support and implement and develop software. And so we kind of sit in between the business and IT, like Brian said, and we're in a unique position where we are on the outside of the IT part of the technology. So we're looking for more on we have a continuous improvement team as well with engineers, but we work collaboratively, the three teams, to bring the best solution to the business. So when it comes to software, that's when our team is leveraged and we come in and are the leading resource on that when it comes to solutioning where software is the viable option. And in this case, software was the option. And so we did a couple of years ago, back in 2016, we're doing an expansion to our cut floor of our processing plant. And part of that expansion was we wanted to eliminate some of the paper that we were moving around and get more value out of our resources, because how are we going to scale managing all of this paper, and where are we going to put all this paper? And it's taking up valuable space. And so when you're looking at a processing plant where you want maximum asset value, you don't want to quote unquote waste that space with a bunch of filing cabinets with paper in them.
Right, right. So the paper was a literal problem, and physically it was creating a challenge for the space. And then I think you also mentioned you literally had two paper pushers. There was one person whose job was to document it. I think one to file. Is that, do I have that right? There was kind of dedicated roles to all this paper as well, right?
Correct. So somebody would manage all of the delegation of the paper and the receiving of the paper, and then validating that it was filled out correctly. And then somebody else would actually key that information from the paper into Excel or some other tool to track the data. And then from there, we would then file it. And then that same person, if we were going through an audit or needing to reference any of it, would be the person that would go back into the filing and find it. And if it went missing, then we'd have to track it down. And so two people
Right.
were dedicated to manage the paper.
Got it. And I think that's important. You know, we get a chance to chat with a lot of you, and this is a common problem. And we talked to a lot of people who are almost embarrassed to say this. This is still a big issue, right? And there's a transition happening. So it doesn't matter how big or small you are. Everybody's in a similar spot. And a lot of times people are figuring out, or they'll ask you, where do we start? This is another good example, right? This was from the business just saying, hey, this is a pain. Too many people are touching this stuff too many times, and then where the heck are we going to put it? So the starting point or the genesis of these projects can be as simple as that, trying to solve, as we were saying here, a paper problem. But as Tracy will share later, I think you'll find that you end up solving a much bigger one as well, which is I think kind of one of my favorite parts of this story here. So Tracy, we talk to a lot of folks, not unlike yourself, right? And so you do the evaluation, you start looking at different types of technology, and so finding that is an important part of the process. And there's a lot of cool stuff out there for all different parts of your business, but there's also some considerations, right? And this is where we hear a lot of people trying to figure out how to navigate this internally, right? What are some things you have to be thinking about or considering as you go into a project like this? What I appreciated about your approach is it was very, very thorough. So I think this applies to not only some larger enterprises, but there's some basic stuff like change management or limited resources that some of our smaller customers and people considering us are facing. So can you talk through a few of these things that you had to work through kind of prior to really taking a step forward?
So for a lot of our projects, we do either an in-depth or an over 30,000 feet buy versus build analysis. If we find that the problem that we're trying to solve is very specific to Highlife, then we tend to navigate towards the build, because we do have software developers that we leverage. However, we do a lot of this investigation on many of our projects, especially when we get to this scale. It also allows us to really make sure that we understand what the business requirements are. And so we do a lot of job shadowing and understanding of the business and understanding of the department and the end users and everybody that will be impacted by whatever it is that we're trying to uh, solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do an extensive mapping of deliverables. We map out milestones and constraints. And then when we try to do the analysis on the build, we map out how much time and effort all of the individual pieces of building this out would be. We are agile, so we would roll this out in phases. And how long would it take for us to do the full rollout? And then we take a lot of that information and we apply it to an RFI, and request for information, and then we take that and we go out into the world and see what best practices are out there, what other solutions are out there, and what they can provide and what value they can add, and then make the decision from there. And if we see that there's building custom doesn't add extensive value and that there's viable products out there, then we will quite often go towards the buy and integrate it into our current systems because we are integrated in our supply chain. And otherwise, if we can't see that anybody meets our need out there, then we will go ahead and we will build.
That makes sense. And one thing I've learned on that is there's the old can versus should there, right? And we're learning more and more people, particularly they're dealing with what we do in the QMS world, food safety all the way through production. It becomes a lot more complicated once you really start understanding what the business needs on the floor there. So I think that's a great process to go through. And then you also had some just natural changes, right? Like you had the cut floor, you had the expansion project going on, you had some changes going there. Talk a little bit about the change management and then the resources you were going to have to live with if you were going to do this one way or the other.
So the same people that were being impacted by the actual physical expansion, so we built a new cut floor, we're going to be impacted by the implementation of this software. So we actually implemented the software before we moved over to the new cut floor so that they had experienced and gone through that change prior to then are in a new work environment and working with new equipment and everything else. And so we tried to be ahead of the game and make that change first so that we were already well into the routine of doing the data collection on the tablets in the cut floor before we went and actually changed the environment in which the users were working in.
Got it.
And so in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the size of a construction project, and I don't know if anybody out there has done any massive expansions or construction projects, a software implementation is a drop in a bucket, right? But it also has massive impact and changes to the end users. And so in this case, it was positive. But it still was a change.
Yeah, no doubt. And I know you're humble, but I'm going to call it out anyway. And it's important for everyone to note as we go through this, because of all the competing priorities, but you guys saw the value in this and did it. Tracy essentially rolled this whole thing out by herself. So it's pretty amazing, but I think it's also a great testimony to not just the work she's done, but hopefully how far the software has come to be able to do that. So you were kind of a one-person team with a little help here and there. Is that a fair way to summarize it? If I don't embarrass you too much.
There is definitely limited resources. So 80% of my time, which doesn't happen very often where we get to dedicate that much time to a single project, I spent focused on implementing this. And so it was all the way from the buy versus build analysis and the requirements gathering to actually sitting down and going through our food safety programs and understanding every single form and every single document and standardizing items and working. I did work with the HACCP and QA team and they provided feedback and allowed me to shadow and understand their job better and allowed me to provide feedback to them on how they do their job, which doesn't always work out very well. But in this case, this was a very it was a great group of people, and I was able to provide feedback to them because when you ask why enough times, then they start to question themselves and
Right.
and stop having to justify things that we've always done that way. And so we didn't just take the paper and turn it electronic. We actually created efficiencies and streamlined things and standardized so that if ever we do expand again as a company, we could copy and paste this to another place and it's not necessarily specific to this environment.
No, that's great, and a great segue to the next step, which is, what made this. One of the things I like to share, both for our customers and folks considering us or just looking at technology, is what makes for a successful technology project. And I think the focus that you had, the priority that you guys put on this, but some of the things you did tactically, and I think you touched on a few of those there, standardizing ahead, implementing before that physical change to the facility. Talk a little bit about too, which I found really, I think I've seen this as a common thread amongst our most successful customers, particularly on enterprise-wide implementations, is getting the operators involved, and in particular, you talked about enlisting champions. Can you talk a little bit about what you did to find those people and get them involved in this process that worked well for you?
So one of the great things about how we go about a lot of our projects is we work and get to know our stakeholders and our end users quite well, and you get an understanding of the culture in which you're stepping into, and who the influencers are in that department, and those are the people you need to win over. So those are the ones you bring donuts to and tell them how great their hair looks, and really get on their good side, because even if you're not directly changing anything that they're doing, if they hold any power within the department that they're in from an influential standpoint, you want them to be on your side, because if you do run into any challenges from a buy-in standpoint, they're the ones that are going to come to bat for you, and they're the ones that in the background will be doing the championing and the rah 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 in the background. And
Yeah.
so I had some fantastic champions on this project, and Margie was just incredible, where if you were to ask her, she would say that she used to dread seeing the blonde walking down the hallway, because she knew that she was going to ask 10,000 questions and put her in a situation where she had to explain everything,
Hmm.
but in the end understood that I was working towards the greater good, and that
Hmm.
I really just wanted to help her, and my goal was to make her life easier, and
Yeah.
have her love the product, and have
Yeah.
her go through this process and be happier to come to work. And so definitely to this day, I'm so glad that I had her, because she was the real reason why, when it there were a few people that found the change really hard because they'd been with the company for 15 years and
Yeah,
have
sure.
always carried their clipboard and couldn't understand why they had to put down their clipboard, and
Right.
they couldn't see the value because they were seeing it from their standpoint. And so
Hmm.
she was really good at taking the information that I was giving to her and look at the value the business gets out of this, and look at how much better Joe Blow can do his job because we're doing this electronically.
Hmm.
And then that's where a lot of our buy-in and successes were.
That's great. Yeah, and I think as somebody taught me once that it was on my team, she just wanted to understand the why behind what we were doing a lot. And I'm sure she's smiling as she's listening to this now. And I think that's what you did. You got the team involved, but they understood what you were doing, why you were doing it. I want to call out also on this slide here, just as people are thinking about this, one of the most powerful things we see is that you're asking these questions and challenging processes. And your note here that we took from our conversation about just the types of questions you ask, right? We did it with 7 forms before. Why couldn't it just be 1 now? And it may be possible and it may not be, but keep in mind as you go to implement software for food safety, compliance, quality, and production, right? As we have this suite that goes end to end, you're entering data once. And so you'll find a lot of times the duplicate entry you're doing manually is not only eliminated because you don't have to do it, but it's captured once at one step and can be applied in a lot of places. So really keep that in mind, that it's not about duplicating what you're doing on paper now. It's about finding a better way and getting more efficient with the technology that enables that. So I think I don't want to understate what you did there. You talked a little bit about these also about shadowing, but one thing that was interesting that you've also done, and I see this as a common element that really gets that engagement level up, is making the data visible to operators. So you were sharing with them why. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like or what the reaction was like for them to start seeing some of that data?
Uh, So one of the biggest things that we were able to achieve with implementing SafetyChain was, when we're doing our QA checks on the floor, if we do face non-compliance, we have VMS screens all over our cut floor, and
Mhm.
we're able to surface that data immediately and apply corrective actions. Where when we're doing it through paper, nobody ever wants to shut down their line in their processing plant.
Yeah,
Then that's the last thing we want to do.
right.
If we're able to go in and provide a corrective action live on the line as it's moving, so that we don't have to pull product or stop the line, is the advantage, and that's where we achieve success. And if we don't have to, after the fact, pull product out of coolers, freezers, or wherever your product is because you need to check it because there was foreign material found or any non-compliance, then you're saving labor, you're not touching product multiple times, which helps you gain shelf life. You're avoiding cross-contamination of any
Yeah.
kind. Anytime you don't have to handle the product multiple times. And if we need to, then we can shut down the line if it's caught soon enough to do the repair before it causes any more damage or gets any worse.
Right. So it's that real-time visibility. We're going to talk more about this. And I think as you start thinking about this, we entered this project on just solving a paper problem. You can start to hear what's evolved from there. And so, yes, there's time savings with productivity and less touches and less paper and all that fun stuff. And that's great. And there's a value in there for sure. What we're starting to hear from Tracy is how this starts impacting the bottom line ROI, right? The profitability, the reduction in waste, the improvement in yields and throughput. And that's where the system really starts to pay for itself many, many times over. So we've talked about what you were facing as a challenge and how you went about it, which I really appreciate you kind of pulling back the curtain there. And I think that's really valuable. And some of the keys that from our perspective, we saw as a successful project that continues to evolve. Let's start talking about what it's done for the business. And you've really been consistent about this. It is all about making sure the business gets the best outcomes here. And so we kind of set out initially talking about the paper pushers. I just love the phrase, right? Literally, we had paper pushers. And now being able, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier is you said we set out to solve a paper problem. We ended up solving a much bigger problem. And I think some of that's illustrated here. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what you've seen in the business here? And I think you just started to touch on it too.
Absolutely. So we had some really great people as resources doing really low value activities within the company. And by eliminating the paper, we were able to, through automation and validation in the forms, we know that we're collecting solid data. We have notifications when forms aren't completed on time, so nobody has to babysit anymore. The data is collected, so there's no rekeying. And for the most part, there's no more paper. And so like we saw a few slides earlier, not every form can be made electronic, and I don't think you should push to make everything electronic. If it just doesn't fit, then it doesn't fit, and there are certain areas where it just doesn't make any sense, and that needs to be okay. We're never going to get rid of 100% of paper. That's always the end goal, but there's always going to be exceptions.
Sure.
Right now, we're completing 16 to 17,000 forms a month at just our plant.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And so could you imagine if we were actually touching if we're like 3 touches per piece of paper every time, and then data entry of all of that information, and then filing all of those pieces of paper because we need to keep them.
Right.
That's extensive. Like that's a lot of value lost just managing this paper. And
Yeah.
so now we've also eliminated, like it says in the next point, we've eliminated the 2 to 3 day lag, because a lot of times the paper would be coming by the end of the day, and on critical matters, they were escalated quickly using radios and stuff like that. But there's always somebody was having a bad day and didn't think that this was a major issue. And once the supervisor was able to actually look at the form and put 2 and 2 together, now we could be a couple of hours to a couple of days behind. Or if a paper was lost because somebody got distracted, and now we don't have any, can't audit that inspection was done at all.
Right.
And so now we're reducing rework. We are adding more value to the tasks that people are completing, and we get dynamic data. Like it's there. The minute you hit submit, if it meets a certain parameters, it's up on the board. We can refresh graphs in real time so that our sales team and our operations team have live data.
Right. Right. And that's nice that you start to add value to other parts of the business as well. And I think you think about, and this is where it's important for everyone watching and listening, you think about, all right, well, what does this mean to my business? You know, for Tracy, which is shipping the large variety of their stuff and a lot of it to other countries, catching that stuff in minutes or an hour versus days later is the difference between some pretty large losses and some pretty large gains, particularly for the revenue side. You also, and this is where your expertise has really been fun to watch, and I think it's been great for our partnerships, seeing what you're doing with the data. You've talked about, now that you have this data, it's become kind of a problem solving or a troubleshooting tool. What did you mean by that?
So we use the reporting and analytics, and we leverage your API web service and pull your data in, or the SafetyChain data, into our data warehouse, where we actually have our own graphs and graph trends. And so the cool thing that you can get out of this product is that you can record trends and drill down in the analytics on things that you never would have correlated before keying stuff into the spreadsheet. So as everybody knows, you put data into a spreadsheet and create a graph, you're only graphing what the data is that you keyed into the spreadsheet. Whereas now we're collecting all of that data and putting it, and are able to leverage filtering and analyzing off of different pivot points. So does the fact that the fan turns on at 3 o'clock in maintenance, or that sanitation does their inspection at 4 o'clock, impact the reason why we have this certain drop in pass rate on the certain line?
Right,
And you can
right.
go in, and some of them are you're chasing your tail, and some of them they prove to be valuable, and you never would have correlated that until now you have all of the data in the same place. And where you're looking at, I'm going to look at all of the forms that, or the data that's collected on a certain area in the plant, and now you're able to see not just your quality um, um, data that's being put through there, but maybe your preventative maintenance and how that's
Yeah,
affected.
right.
And so there's a lot of visibility, and you're able to do a lot of trend analysis just by collecting the data. And of course, you have to make sure that your forms are conducive to this. So you have to have an understanding of how you want to be able to correlate the information. But it's fairly simple. And then once you have it standardized, then you'll definitely see the value out of it.
Yeah. I think your project manager carries gleaming ear to ear with that statement for sure. So that's great. It's great because it's data most people have never had, but it's in their hands, but it's been flowing through their facilities, right? And it can be so valuable. And I think you've just done a masterful job at slicing and dicing it and doing some really interesting things with it to help make better business decisions. And you've talked about, you know, it's getting this data, right? And I think that's one misnomer a lot of people think is, oh, when we go paperless, and you've already shared about the massive amount of time savings, and that's a real ROI, no doubt. But a lot of people say, oh, well, our people have been on clipboards for 30 years and they can write faster, and that may be true. The time savings isn't necessarily who can type it or write it faster. It's that you only do it once, and now that data is in there, and it could be applied across your entire process. And you talked about getting more types of data here and being able to act a little bit faster. Anything you would add to these points here that you've seen?
One of the great things that we've found is we're able to build and roll out a form way faster than we have historically when we had to do it paper-based, or simply saying, we complete this form um, 7 times a day. Let's add this question to see if we're troubleshooting an issue. I wonder what this means. Like, do we see this when we do the inspection? So do we see wrinkles in boxes, or like
Right.
whatever information you're trying to gather, like the question you're trying to answer? You just add the question to the form. Somebody's out there doing that inspection anyways, and now you're collecting the data, and you're sitting back and you're just watching, and you're able to see whether or not that data is of value. And if it's not, then it's not a lot of wasted effort. You didn't have to send somebody out there on a number of occasions to shadow and watch. You just added one question to a form.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see that doesn't seem to be an issue, you can just remove the question, and now we don't have to track that data anymore because we didn't find anything corollary out of it.
Right, right. No, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about the form testing. That's a great way of thinking about the use of it. The, I think you've touched on some of these throughout, so I don't want to um, go back to all of these, but one that I do want to call out that I think a lot of people have questions on, Tracy, is usability. And you've talked so much about the operators, which is, I think, one of the things that have made you guys very successful. Can you talk, you mentioned a little bit about where they were, right? I have my clipboard and I always have my clipboard. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like for that change and the usability on the floor, and maybe how they feel about it now from what you've seen?
One of the things that you gain a big understanding of when you're shadowing someone and doing their job with them is you understand how they interact. So how are they interacting with the tool, whether that's a piece of paper or whether it's a software device or an app. You want to know how they go through their work process. I walk here, I do this, I walk over there, I put this down, I do that. So you want to make sure that whatever tool that or I'm wearing gloves, that's another one that's huge in our case. We want to make sure that whatever product we choose, and this is not SafetyChain specific, is keeping the user in mind. It's not always about, if people are not going to use a tool to its full capabilities if they don't like it. If they
Yeah.
feel like it's constricting to their workday and it's just something that some person sitting at a desk told me I had to do, they're not going to like it. And it doesn't matter how great your change management is, they are not going to go above and beyond and do their job to the best of their ability because they're not going to like using the tool. So the tool
Yeah.
has to be conducive to how the person does their job. So it has to be configured correctly and it has to be user friendly, and it can't be difficult and complicated. And one of the biggest things I harp on to any software vendor is if your software is complex and you have somebody using this tool on top of like physical work, they're not going to want to have to spend an extra 5 or 6 minutes to weed their way through to gather the information. They're
Yeah.
not going to do it as well as if it was easy and quick and simple.
Yeah. No, I couldn't. You've said it perfectly. That is the key. We can have the greatest tools in the world, but if they're not used, they're not adding value for sure.
Absolutely.
Very, very cool. You've given a couple of really nice examples, and I didn't want to skip over this one if you wanted to touch on it, but I think there's some preventative parts to the electronic side of things. Did you want to touch on that example, or I know you gave a couple other different ones as well.
Yeah, so one of the big added values that we had to, and we leverage SafetyChain as a tool to do this, is we do final label verification. So anything that's going on a container that we're exporting, if the final label doesn't match the manifest, then it could be denied at the port or at the border or anywhere. And that's anybody who's doing export will have that problem. So all of the labels need to match all of the documentation going straight through, and they have to be compliant. And so we have these tools in place to these checks to make sure that all boxes are labeled correctly, and we leverage SafetyChain to do these inspections. And we do over 10,000 a month of these
Wow.
inspections to ensure that the labels on our products are correct.
Yeah. Again, just another, depending on what you do, this is just another example of, yes, you can save time, and yes, now you have data to spot and make adjustments, or in this case, even prevent issues from happening that could really make an impact to what you're able to ship out, which is what we're trying to do, right? Ship safe, quality food. As we kind of turn the corner and start to wrap things up, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, you've mentioned a few examples of how the cost savings is there, and just take some folks through a very simple example that I think you shared with me. And you gave this really cool insight. We listed it all here, right? You explained, like, this is what manual paper life looks like in a facility for us, right? These are all the different steps, and you actually listed, I think you nailed all of these, Tracy, pretty good, right? So you talked about this earlier in our conversation here about all the different times and ways people are touching paper through the facility. So yes, we want to make that faster, easier. We want to make it consistent. We want to get to that data. We want to make it visible, and that's all great. And as you're starting to think about, where is the ROI? Because we understand that wanting software is something most people do now, and needing it is there's a true need. There's a value we can provide, but we still have to justify the business case for it. And this is a really fun example that you took us through, Tracy. I think you had even just said earlier you were up to 16 or 17,000 records a month, but take me through really quick what your thought was around cost savings, because this isn't getting into anything behind the curtain for you guys. This is just an example if you were to apply a very simple amount, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, if we were to apply $1 per every piece of paper, and I think that's way undershooting. Like you saw on the previous
Yeah,
slide, there's a long list of every time we touch that piece of paper,
right.
of things that we go through. And from an auditing standpoint, we can't afford to not have that record,
Hmm.
and we need that traceability. And so at $1 a record, that's $14,000 a month that we're just on the paper alone. That's not the manual labor of having to pull product out of a cooler because of a
Right.
non-compliance, or having to stop the line, or like all of these other areas where we would be negatively impacted if there was any delay in surfacing that information and reacting to it in a more dynamic corrective action.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the $1 I think is quite low.
I think we agree. We also agreed it would warrant a really nice large raise for you too, right? So that's good. So, but it's true. I mean, there's a lot of value that's been created, and again, I don't want to understate this. I know I keep coming back to it. This started with a paper problem, right? We got to get off the paper. We have too many filing cabinets, and look at what they've been able to do. And then you look below, and Tracy has done a nice job today of kind of touching on some of these other areas where we've talked about, less rework or returns or waste and higher yield, making sure these shipments get out. And you could start figuring out the cost. What does it cost for your line to be down? What does it cost when you miss a shipment? And these are all very real costs that your executive teams are thinking about, and where this type of a solution with SafetyChain can really help when it's set up properly, as Highlife has done here. So a couple quick things as we wrap up here. One, just any general feedback. What are you hearing? And this is kind of the fun part, because we love to make our champions look like heroes internally. We love helping the businesses do a better job keeping our food safe and improving their business. What's kind of been the general feedback? Anything else that you'd want to share? I know you talked a little bit about how everybody likes on the floor now too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. From our QA to our HACCP team to operations, there's nobody that would go back to the clipboards.
Yeah.
Everybody loves the tool. It's really easy to use. The data is there. You don't have to worry about losing a piece of papers, because even we found out that the people that were filling out the forms would
Hmm.
get stressed if they lost the piece of paper, and it happens. Like I got distracted and was doing this, and I put the paper down, and the skid disappeared that I set my paper on, or my
Right.
clipboard on, and now I got to go find it. And so
Right.
that was stressful too. And so there's anybody that I've spoke to has said that they would not go back to the paper-based forms. And we've even had some of the ones that we didn't translate to electronic. We've had actually them come back and say, hey, is there any way we can change it so that we can make it electronic? Because it
Hmm.
would just be easier if I didn't have to use the paper at all.
Right. Right.
There's from a supervisor and management standpoint, they love the fact that they can go in and see the pictures. The pictures are a huge thing, where
Mm.
now we can take a picture of a non-compliance or even of a compliance or any observation, and have it attached to the record, and it's always there. We can zoom in on it. We can embed it in part of our reports, so that we can look to see that on AM shift something looks like this, and on PM shift it looks like this, and they look
Mhm.
different. Now, why do they look different? Um, and even the senior execs can now go in and look at things and forms that they never had access to before, without asking somebody else to give them the information. Now
Right.
now they have direct access to it, and they can log in and they can take a look for themselves.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great, and that's what we want is everyone being able to get the data that's important to them. So, um, last question for you. I always like to share when I get someone like you on that has a lot of experience here and has had a lot of success in the industry and also in our project is just learnings, takeaways, things that you might either do differently or that you would recommend to those that are where kind of you were before this project. And you also have the added advantage that you do a lot of this, right? So obviously you've successfully implemented SafetyChain and continue to add more to it. And you do this with other projects. We were just talking about one earlier today that you're starting with completely different type of part of the business. So anything you would share with folks that are looking at technology, looking at SafetyChain and just kind of trying to figure out where to get started?
Yeah, one of the advantages that Highlife has is they have a solutions team, and we go out and we investigate what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and then we do root cause analysis and really figure out, like, if we're trying to, a lot of the times the business will say, I want X,
Mm,
and so and you have to figure out, well, if X is the answer, then what's the question? What are we really trying to solve for here? And
yeah.
so we go in and we ask those questions. So I think it's really important. If I don't like this, well, what is it that you don't like? Well, why don't you like it?
Hmm.
And keep asking those questions over and over, and then you end up to the root of the problem. And there's a lot of times where the root cause is not actually what the end users think it is. And sometimes you, after a lot of digging and questions, and you find out that there is some low-hanging fruit you can um, solution, and
Yeah.
then you're off to the races.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. I love
Another
that
one of the,
question. If that's the answer, what is the question? I've stolen that from you, by the way. I love
if
it.
that's the answer, what's the
So,
question?
sorry, go ahead.
I stole that from my senior director, so
Ah, perfect.
so that's his line. One of the other things that we really try hard to do, and it puts us in a unique situation, is we always create a selection committee or a project group that's not just the business. One of the biggest things that we've found is vendors are salespeople, and they're going to
Mhm.
sell you on they will solve all of your problems, even though they don't know what your problems are or what your requirements are. Um, and so we do our due diligence ahead of time to make sure that we put together and find solutions that will meet all of the requirements before we put them as a demo in front of our business, because people get blinded by the bling, and then you're having to redirect them and say, well, this actually doesn't solve for all of these things. And they say, it's
Right,
okay, but it does this. And then
right,
you go and implement, and they say, well, how come it doesn't do all of these other things?
right,
Like, we
right.
needed it to do those things. And, well, we told you that, but you said it does this, so it doesn't matter. And
Mm,
so I find that if you have somebody who's unbiased come in and do a lot of that pre-vetting to make sure whatever products that you present to the business will meet the majority of the requirements, then you've already set your business up to succeed in selection.
that's extremely valuable, knowing what questions to ask and where we've also tried to invest a lot on our teams too, to have people from the industry that can help you shape those questions if you don't have a team like there. You've also talked to working with IT. Sometimes we see customers avoid that. I think your advice here is get them involved early and often, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime you're implementing technology, the value is there to include IT. I would never exclude them. Um, I don't sit in IT, but I work hand in hand with IT all the time. And if they don't have the infrastructure to support whatever solution you're trying to implement, then you're going to fail. And so you need to work collaboratively with them in order to be successful on any solution.
Right. No, that's good advice. And last but not least, your final thoughts on paper. How do you really feel?
It, I would get rid of paper altogether if I could, but there's always certain places where you just can't get away from it.
Yeah. And that's a fair statement too, right? That's being realistic with how the business works. And I think you've shown a lot of really valuable ways to use the data, capture the data, and you've been a great partner. And as we joke about, Tracy obviously knows her stuff, and she's challenged us and asked good questions of us as she has of her own teams, and has helped us become, I think, better. And it's been really fun to work with you. And I'm really grateful that you shared some of your insight and some of your success. And we're looking forward to doing more with you. And I think there's hopefully a lot of value that everyone else took away as well. So thanks so much for making the time to be here.
No problem.
For everybody else, I think the questions that I'm seeing coming in are more on the feature side. And as I mentioned in the opening, our goal here is focused on sharing the story, and we'll be covering more of a pure demo day here. We also have a pre-recorded link, which is easy to hop in and take a look at. So we'll share a link to that so you can watch that, or as we mentioned also, it's always helpful to kind of have a discussion and learn a little bit more about your business and what issues you're facing, as Tracy had mentioned, so we can kind of tailor a demo that makes the most sense for where you're at and what you're looking for. So we hope this was helpful for all of you that were able to join us. We appreciate you making time in your busy schedules, and we look forward to chatting more with you about how we might be able to help. So Tracy, thank you again, and thanks everybody else for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.